To understand what Dean Martin did for Peter Lawford, you need to understand the magnitude of Frank Sinatra's rage. Frank didn't just get angry, he got biblical. When someone crossed him, Frank made sure they paid for it for the rest of their lives. And Peter Lawford had committed the ultimate sin. He'd chosen family over Frank. Peter Lawford was married to Patricia Kennedy, JFK's sister. He'd been the bridge between the Kennedy family and the Rat Pack. He'd helped organize fundraisers. He'd made introductions. He'd played the role of Hollywood ambassador to Camelot. And Frank had loved it. Frank Sinatra saw himself as kingmaker. He believed his support had helped put JFK in the White House. He'd campaigned for Kennedy. He'd raised money. He'd used his influence with labor unions and, yes, with organized crime figures to deliver votes. In Frank's mind, the Kennedys owed him. So when Frank built that compound in Palm Springs with the presidential guest wing, he wasn't just being a generous host. He was claiming his reward. He was showing the world that Frank Sinatra was powerful enough to host the President of the United States. But Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General and JFK's brother, had other plans. Bobby Kennedy was on a crusade against organized crime, and Frank Sinatra's connections to mobsters like Sam Giancana were well documented. Bobby told his brother Jack that staying at Frank's house would be political suicide. The FBI had files on Frank. The press was watching. If the president stayed at Sinatra's compound, it would validate every conspiracy theory about the Kennedys and the mob. JFK agreed. But instead of calling Frank himself, he made Peter Lawford do it. Peter was in an impossible position. On one side was his brother-in-law, the President of the United States. On the other side was Frank Sinatra, the most powerful man in entertainment and someone who did not accept rejection well. Peter tried to soften the blow. He called Frank and explained that the president had security concerns, that the Secret Service preferred Bing Crosby's compound because it was more secure, that it wasn't personal. Frank saw through it immediately. It was completely personal. The Kennedys were rejecting him, and Peter, his supposed friend, was enabling it. Frank's response was volcanic. He took a sledgehammer and personally destroyed the helipad he'd built for Kennedy. He ripped out the phone lines. He smashed furniture. And then he turned his rage on Peter Lawford. Peter was immediately excommunicated from the Rat Pack. Frank made it clear. Anyone who worked with Peter Lawford would never work with Frank Sinatra again. In Hollywood in 1961, that was a death sentence. The Rat Pack had been filming Ocean's 11 and were planning sequels. Peter was written out of all future projects. Robin and the Seven Hoods, which was supposed to star the full Rat Pack, went forward without Peter. His role was given to Bing Crosby. Frank refused to be in the same room as Peter. When they'd run into each other at industry events, Frank would turn his back and walk away. He told other performers, other producers, other studio heads, "Peter Lawford is dead to me. Treat him accordingly," and Hollywood obeyed. Peter's career collapsed. The phone stopped ringing. Offers dried up. He'd been a successful actor before the Rat Pack, but now nobody would hire him. The unofficial blacklist was brutal and complete. Peter tried to reach out to Frank to explain, to apologize, but Frank wouldn't take his calls. He tried to go through mutual friends, but nobody wanted to get between Frank and his rage. By 1962, Peter Lawford was essentially unemployed, drinking heavily, and watching his marriage to Patricia Kennedy fall apart. The entire industry had abandoned him. except Dean Martin. Dean had watched the whole thing unfold with growing discomfort. He understood Frank's anger. Dean knew what it felt like to be betrayed, but he also knew Peter hadn't really done anything wrong. Peter had been caught between two impossible loyalties, and he'd chosen family. Dean respected that. More importantly, Dean saw what the blacklist was doing to Peter as a human being. Peter was drowning. His confidence was shattered. His finances were in ruins. He'd started drinking not socially, but desperately, trying to numb the pain of being erased from the only world he'd ever known. Dean didn't make a public stand. That wasn't his style. He didn't call Frank and argue about it. Dean knew Frank well enough to know that would only make things worse. Instead, Dean did something quiet and subversive. He kept calling Peter. When everyone else in Hollywood stopped returning Peter's calls, Dean's phone line stayed open. They'd meet for lunch at out-of-the-way restaurants where the press wouldn't see them. Dean would slip Peter money when he needed it, disguising it as loans they both knew would never be repaid. When Peter's career hit absolute rock bottom, Dean made phone calls to producers and directors on Peter's behalf. He didn't tell them Frank had approved. He just said, "Peter's a good actor. You should use him." Dean's endorsement carried weight. Not as much weight as Frank's condemnation, but enough to get Peter occasional work. Small roles, guest appearances on TV shows, enough to keep Peter from going completely under. Sammy Davis Jr. knew what Dean was doing, and he was torn. Sammy loved Frank. He owed Frank everything. Frank had stood by Sammy when the rest of Hollywood rejected him for being black. Frank had threatened to cancel his own wedding when the hotel wouldn't let Sammy stay there. Sammy's loyalty to Frank was absolute, but Sammy also saw what Dean was doing for Peter, and he recognized it as something extraordinary. One night in 1964, Sammy and Dean were having drinks after a show in Las Vegas. Sammy finally brought it up. "You're still helping Peter, aren't you?" Dean didn't deny it. "Yeah." Sammy shook his head in amazement. "You know, Frank would lose his mind if he found out?" "Probably," Dean said calmly. "Then why do you do it?" "Because Peter's my friend. Because he's hurting. Because everyone abandoned him, and that's not right. But Frank's your friend, too." Dean took a sip of his drink. "Frank's got plenty of people standing with him. Peter's got nobody." Sammy stared at Dean for a long moment. Then he said something Dean never forgot. "You know what you are? You're a saint." Dean laughed. "I'm not a saint, Sammy. I'm just a guy who makes phone calls." "No," Sammy insisted. "What you're doing, risking Frank's anger to help someone nobody else will help, that's not just friendship. That's Christ-like. That's the kind of thing that makes you a better man than the rest of us." Dean was uncomfortable with the praise. "Don't make me out to be a hero. I'm not doing anything special. You're doing what none of the rest of us have the courage to do," Sammy said. "You're standing with someone when the whole world turned against them. That's the definition of courage." Dean's quiet support of Peter Lawford continued for years. Through the 1960s, as Frank's rage gradually cooled from volcanic to merely cold, Dean maintained his friendship with Peter. He never publicized it. He never used it to make himself look good. He just kept showing up for someone who needed a friend. In 1965, Dean was filming a Western and had some influence over the casting. He got Peter a small role. Nothing major, just a few days of work, but it paid decently and gave Peter something to do besides drink. The production manager mentioned it to someone who mentioned it to someone else, and eventually word got back to Frank. Frank called Dean. "I heard you gave Peter Lawford a job." Dean was ready for this conversation. "I did." Frank was silent for a moment. Then he said, "You know how I feel about him." "I do." "So why would you do that?" "Because he needed the work, Frank, and because he's not a bad guy. He got caught in the middle of something that wasn't his fault." "He chose the Kennedys over me," Frank said, the anger still fresh in his voice even 4 years later. "He chose his wife's family over his friend," Dean corrected. "If your wife's brother was president and I asked you to choose between him and me, what would you do?" Frank didn't answer. Dean continued, "I'm not asking you to forgive him. I'm not asking you to be his friend again. I'm just saying he's struggling and I'm helping him. If that pisses you off, I'm sorry. But I'm not going to stop." Frank was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, quieter. "You're a better man than me, Dino. I don't know about that." "I do," Frank said. "I know exactly what you're doing and why you're doing it, and I can't do it. I can't forgive him. But I'm not going to stop you from helping him." Dean felt relief wash over him. "Thanks, Frank. Just don't expect me to show up at any parties where he is." "I won't. And tell him," Frank paused, "tell him I hope he's doing okay." Dean smiled. "I will." Frank never fully forgave Peter Lawford. The friendship was permanently damaged. But Frank's rage mellowed over time and he stopped actively trying to destroy Peter's career. Dean's quiet intervention had created space for Peter to survive. Peter Lawford never fully recovered from the blacklist. His career never returned to its former heights. His drinking got worse. His personal life continued to spiral. He died in 1984 at the age of 61. His body destroyed by alcohol and his heart broken by the rejection he'd never fully overcome. But for the 23 years between the blacklist and his death, Peter Lawford knew he had at least one friend in Hollywood, one person who hadn't abandoned him, one person who'd stood by him when it would have been so much easier to walk away. At Peter's funeral in 1984, Dean Martin was one of the few Rat Pack members who attended. Frank didn't come. Sammy wanted to, but was filming and couldn't make it. But Dean was there, sitting quietly in the back, paying his respects to a man the world had forgotten. After the service, Patricia Kennedy Lawford, Peter's ex-wife, approached Dean. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Of course," Dean replied. "I loved Peter." She looked at him with tears in her eyes. "He told me what you did for him, how you were the only one who didn't abandon him. You kept him alive, Mr. Martin. You gave him hope when he had nothing else." Dean didn't know what to say. Peter was a good man. He deserved better than what he got. "He had you," Patricia said. "That was better than nothing. That was everything." The story of what Dean Martin did for Peter Lawford never became widely known during their lifetimes. Dean didn't publicize it. Peter was too proud to talk about it. It was a private act of compassion that played out behind the scenes while the world focused on Frank Sinatra's rage and the Rat Pack's glamour. But Sammy Davis Jr. never forgot it. Years later, in the 1980s, Sammy was asked in an interview about the difference between Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra. Sammy thought for a moment and then said, "Frank is loyalty. If you're with Frank, he'll go to war for you. He'll destroy anyone who tries to hurt you. That's a beautiful thing. But Dean is grace. Dean doesn't go to war. He doesn't destroy people. He just quietly helps the ones who are hurting. He stands with the people everyone else abandoned. That takes a different kind of courage. That takes a bigger heart. What Dean Martin did for Peter Lawford wasn't dramatic. It wasn't newsworthy. It didn't make headlines or win awards. But it was profound. It was the kind of friendship that asks nothing in return. The kind of compassion that risks personal consequences to help someone in need. The kind of courage that stands alone when everyone else is walking away. Frank Sinatra was the king of the Rat Pack. He had the power, the charisma, the ability to command a room. But Dean Martin had something Frank didn't have. The moral courage to stand with someone when it was unpopular. To extend grace when everyone else was extending judgment. To be a friend when friendship was inconvenient. That's why Sammy Davis Jr. called Dean Martin a saint. Not because Dean was perfect, not because he never made mistakes, but because in the moment that mattered. When Peter Lawford was drowning and everyone else was watching him sink, Dean Martin reached out his hand and pulled him up. That's not just friendship. That's humanity at its best.